Hi guys, it's Kyle from Regrettable Props, and today I'm showing you how to make a foam longsword that is convention safe. You can apply this technique to any type of sword that you want to make out of foam, but today I'm showing you how to make a longsword to go with my warden costume. To determine the length of the sword, the total length, I measured up to my armpits, and I did that based off this image. I did some research, and depending on the area and the time period of the world that you were in, the average for the length of the sword is going to vary, so I just went off this, and I felt like it's an appropriate length for myself. So once I did that, I measured up to my armpit. That's about 137 centimeters for me. I grabbed onto a ruler to measure the length of the hilt that I would need to subtract from that total length of the sword that we just got, and I got that to be about 19 centimeters for me. I added an additional 5 centimeters for the pommel and guard to be subtracted from the total sword length. So to give that into a more mathematical perspective from you, the total sword length for me is 137 centimeters. Adding the pommel, the guard, and the length of the hilt that I calculated for me, that is about 29 centimeters in length. So we're going to take 137 minus 29, and we're left with about 109 centimeters for the total blade length. That gives you an idea on how much foam you need to cut out, or how long of those strips of foam. So once we've determined that, I cut out some 6 centimeter wide strips of foam, and then I staggered it a bit so that the points where the pieces met would not be in the same area, so they would not cause structural weak points. Once we've done that, I've marked down the middle of my pieces of foam on both long halves of the foam. Where the middle is going to be, I'm going to be doing this on the non-texture side. My reason is to help have a better seam for when we connect these two halves together, and I'm going to be sanding off that texture portion to help get the angles that I need for making it look like a foam sword. So then I'm going to be using a Dremel from there, using a rotary attachment. You gotta want to take this pretty slow, be careful. You may want to use a straight edge or something else to rest the Dremel while you're going down the length of that line to get a more straight consistent line. I went about half to a third of the way through this 10 centimeter foam, and once we've done that on both sides, we're going to obviously insert our CPVC tubing. So determine however much of tubing you needed. I obviously left enough out to account for the guard, hilt, and pommel from that foam blade section. So if you need to take that in consideration when buying that piece of tubing, please do so. Once we have both sides hollowed out for where we're going to be putting this tubing, I'm using hot glue, and I'm going to glue in that tubing for the approximate. Once we have both sides of the blade hollowed out, I'm going to be using hot glue to secure that tubing, and I'm only gluing down in the channel that we just recessed with the Dremel, and I want to make sure that area is good, so I'm going to do a little bit each bit of the way. I'm using hot glue instead of contact cement because I don't have good brands of contact cement near me, and hot glue is going to allow for a bit of a better bond because of the gaps that you might have from being inconsistent with your dremeling. And for my sword, for the very tip of it, because I didn't know how tapered the sword I was going to make, I used a piece of coat hanger and for the very tip of the sword, and then I made sure I gave a huge amount of hot glue for where it connected within the piece of tubing, because it goes into the tubing, so you want to make sure it's secured within there so it's not going to be making any noise or come loose. So you want to make sure you have a good amount of hot glue in there so then both parts are secured. So when we're gluing both sections together, you want to very small increments. I'm using hot glue. You could use contact cement if you want, but I just simply went with hot glue because that's what most people have, and it's convenient to what I'm going to be using. So I put 1/2 flat on the ground, and I made sure to do small sections, and then I'm using all my weight to hold it down and make sure it's fully cooled, because then if it's not fully cooled and you got some inconsistency with like the hot glue peeling from the foam, and it's going to be a bit of a mess. So make sure you like hold it there for about a good couple minutes, and then just do the same process all the way till you have a foam sandwich of that rectangular length that you cut out. Once we've done that, this is what it's going to be looking roughly. You're going to notice there's a bit of a bulge in the middle. To me, that's fine because we can use that as a guide to help determine where we want those edges of the sword to be. So you can make sure on that piece of sword, on the outside, on the texture portion, you do a line down the middle, because we're going to be using that to help determine the edges for the sword. And then I am just using the meter stick to help determine the taper from that I'm going to be doing to the sword to help give it a better shape for the final product. Once we have everything traced out for the outline of the sword, you're going to want to carve that away using an X-Acto blade or using a bandsaw, whatever you have to help cut off some excess of foam. And what I'm doing now currently is I'm using the X-Acto blade to take away some of the excess of the foam. That way it's a lot easier, or it's a lot less sanding for me to do. And we're going to the edge of where the sandwich meets, and we're just going up to the line that's down the middle of the blade. So the pitch of the angle of the sword is going to change a little bit, but you're going to want to be careful. Use a sharp blade, or you could just use a saw to cut this off. But doing this process or step takes away a lot of the sanding that we're going to have to do in the future. For this portion, we're going to be sanding away, helping to shape that angle of the blade. I would completely advise using a sanding belt or a actual sander for this. I did not have one that had the correct grit that I needed, so I'm needing to pick that up in the future if I ever plan to do something like this. But you can obviously use a Dremel and a rotary attachment to help shape the blade. Make sure you're doing this very slow and carefully, maybe on a slow speed in a finer grit, probably around like 80 or something, if you're able to know or change the grits of your sanding attachment. And we're once again following the same pattern up to the middle of the sword, and where the two pieces of the foam meet on the edge, that's the path that we're going to be following for sanding. If you're a little bit unsure with what I mean, I am kind of blocking the camera right now, but I think you're able to tell by the process of what I'm describing to the look that you're trying to achieve. Now, since we used a rotary tool or a Dremel to get that shape of the sword, we're going to have some inconsistencies. We're going to have some highs and lows. So I'm going to be using a 150 grit to sand away and help clean up that edge that we sanded. I'm going to show you here what the result looks like. And obviously you're going to do this on all the sides of the sword. That way you're getting a much better looking blade than if you were to just leave it at that first step of shaping it. I have a bit of a recording issue, but from here I made a very quick pommel and guard. You can just use something or some design from whatever that you want to try and achieve. And obviously I went to the same method of sanding and shaping with the Dremel. Afterwards I coated the entire sword in black paint mixed with Modge Podge. I did about 2 to 3 coats. I did this on all pieces of the foam. I did not do this for the PVC for the hilt. After letting it fully dry, I used a dark metal color. This is all painted by acrylics to give a base coat for the sword, and then I went over it afterwards with a lighter silver. And once that had dried itself, I went over with a black wash to help give some inconsistencies to the metal. And to paint the guard and pommel, I did a red base coat. Supposedly this helps make the gold stand out better, but from there I fully let the red dry and then painted on the gold to help give it that aged look that we are trying to achieve. And I also applied the black wash to these gold sections of the sword. Once letting all our paints dry, I sealed the entire foam finally with a coat of clear gloss finish for the entire sword piece. And then for the handle, the hilt, you can either wrap around leather or tape or hockey tape. I used hockey tape, or any type of preference around the hilt. And here you can see on screen the final product alongside the first sword I made, which is out of wood using aluminum tape, which was a process that I saw on Tested. But here you guys can see the durability of it smacking. If it does get any wrinkles from impacts or whatever, you can use a heat gun, very carefully heat up that foam, and it'll cause it to remove those wrinkles. But you can see just by stressing it, waving it back and forth, what it'll look like under some motions, and how none of the foam or the seams for where we connected are coming apart. Anyways, this has been Kyle from Regrettable Props. Once again, materials could be linked or mentioned in the description, and stay tuned for next week's video. I hope you guys have a good day. Bye.